Yes, we are just ready. And against my nature, I have now to play the role of Cerberus, you know, the mythological figure of Cerberus. We are going to have 5 papers, which means you understand the implication. I have to obtain the respects of the time. But I think that we are 5 minutes in advance to our timetable, and I am very pleased to give the floor to Professor Paolo Donati from the University of Bologna and a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, whose paper has been already circulated, and the title which is How the Digital Matrix Redefines Human Identities and Relations. Pierpaolo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano, very much. I will project a few slides in order to sum up the long paper I have sent by email, in the hope that the paper was read by the participants, at least by some of them. Let me try to share the screen now and see if I can. Now, the issue is the enhancement of human beings through digital technologies, which raises the question of evaluating whether and how the latter promote the flourishing or vice versa, the alienation of what is properly and genuinely human. Now, the basic issue is this one. I think that digital technologies, what they do is detaching the mind from the body, splitting them. And in face of this issue, I think we have to look at the relationship between the human and the technology. That is putting our focus upon the relationality between human person and digital devices. This is what we have to do, basically. Now, let me define what I mean by digital matrix or digital technological matrix. From the cultural, structural, and practical point of view, the digital technological matrix can be defined as the globalized symbolic code that governs the creation of digital technologies designed to enhance or replace human action, radically changing social identities and relationships. Now, I cannot enter into this definition of the digital matrix as a globalized symbolic code, but I hope that in the paper you can find the details of this definition. Why the change is radical? It's radical because digital technologies substitute the virtual, that means the fictitious, for the analog. Secondly, because the digital tools of enhancement affect a human person's identities by changing social relations. And since digital relations inform, that is, put a form into people's identities and social organizations, then virtual relations hybridize the human. Now, the issue is about hybridization. We have to confront the digital and technological mind, looking at the emergence of what I call the humanted. That means the human augmented by technologies. Now, what about the hybridization process? The hybridization of people's identities, social relations, and social organizations lies in the fact that these entities change their relational constitution through the following processes. First, the blurring of the distinction between reality and virtuality. Second, the blurring of the distinctions between human, machine, and nature. Third, the reversal from information scarcity to information abundance. And lastly, the shift from the primacy of entities, that is substances, to the primacy of interactions, transactions, and the relations. Now, what strikes me is that the digital technological matrix progressively transforms humanness and society by changing social identities and relations through mentalization. That's the first slide I projected. Mentalization means to detach our mind from the body, our mind from the environment. Behind that, or in a way as a presupposition for the mentalization process, there is the idea of a quantum mind. The quantum mind is the, let's say, the leading idea of the technological digital matrix. Now, what I want to clarify is the morphogenetic cycle of structure, agency, and culture run by the digital technological matrix, which generates the hybridization of society with the emergence of what I call the passive humanity, that is the human augmented in a passive way. The process is quite complex, but I want to summarize it in this way. On the right side, you find the structural domain, that is the hardware of the matrix. When you introduce a new device, a new algorithm, a robot, and artificial intelligence, you change the structural conditioning because the machines occupy role positions in the social structure. And this changes social interactions. There are structural hybridizations between social positions and roles. And from that, there is the emergence of what I call structural hybrids. Now, if you go this line below, if the human agency is very weak, if the human agency has a reduced or impeded reflexivity, that is, we have a passive humanity, then the human agency cannot do anything to change this process. And the structural change, the structural conditioning goes directly into the cultural domain, that is the software of the matrix. So to change the cultural conditioning of interactions. And from that, social cultural interactions start to hybridize culture. And in the end of this process, we have cultural hybrids, which in turn reinforce the structural domain. So the human agency, in a way, is passed by. I mean, the human agency cannot do much in order to cope with the hybridization process, which is making the human more and more passive. So we need, therefore, to promote an active humanity through the increase of both personal and relational reflexivity. Reflexivity is the only way to foster a creative adaptation of human agency under imperatives that arise from the environment. Now, this is the same slide previously projected, which describes the active humanity. The active humanity is a human agency which is capable of a morphogenesis in itself, which changes or can influence the relationship between the structural and the cultural domains, so that the structural hybrids are subjected to the human intentionality, the intentionality of the human agency when a humanity is elaborated. What I think is that the humanity is inevitable in a way. We cannot think that the human will not be changed by digital technologies, but by what I call the digital matrix. So when the agency, the human agency, is sufficiently reflexive, we speak of a relational subject. The relational subject is a human person able to react to the hybridization of her identity. What we have to reinforce is precisely the personal reflexivity. Now, this slide describes what the relational subject is, starting from the social structure, the social conditioning in the positions and roles of the social structure. The initial positioning of the subject. The subject starts reacting by personal, internal reflexivity, but the internal reflexivity is not enough in order to change the hybridization process. So we have to consider how the initial cultural identity of the reflexive subject creates interactions, give rise to new interactions, which redefine the cultural identity in such a way as the subject's relational reflexivity, that is the reflexivity of the subject upon her social relations, not as an internal inner conversation, but as a reaction and an action on the relations between the human person and the technology. So to change the structure of the subject's social relations and redefine the structural identity, so to repersonalize the positions, the social position, the social roles of the relational subject. So the relational subject is a subject able to act upon social relations reflexively. That is reacting not on herself only in the inner conversation and not only on the other, but precisely by managing the relationships between the human person and the technology. Now, the question is, when digital technologies achieve human enhancement, my opinion is that in order to evaluate whether an organization providing digital enhancement is more or less humanizing or not humanizing at all, it's necessary to adopt the relational optics. That is, to adopt a relational paradigm, which means assessing the effects of the intervention of the organization on the relations, both between the body and the mind of the person, and on the specificity of interhuman relationships in respect to other types of relationships. I don't have enough time to get into the relational paradigm, but what I want to stress is the importance of focusing upon the relationality. So I go to the conclusions, which are about the difference of being human before and after the matrix. This is explained in a book just appeared, Transcending Modernity with Relational Thinking, which is precisely on this issue. What I think is that in hybridized organizations, enhancement through digital technology has a humanizing character, provided that the empowerment to act is viewed as arising from interaction within mutually empathic and mutually empowering relationships. So it doesn't matter the intentions of the subjective feelings of people. It is a matter of how relationships are forged managed and so on and so forth. For instance, many people do not understand the difference in the quality and causal powers of the relationships between human and artificial intelligence or robot and interhuman relationships. They think that they are always same, they are relations. But what I insist is in differentiating these kinds of relationships. The human-robot, let's say, relationship is qualitatively and substantially different from an interhuman relationship. But we need a theory of social relations as such. Now, the main argument in this slide is, by reading what is written down, even if it were possible to have an artificial intelligence or robots capable of a certain inner reflexivity, and there are people who argue that robots can have a first-person perspective, this will not be enough to distinguish the human relationship from the digital one, because the gap between the human robot relationship and the interhuman relationship consists in the relational reflexivity. There is the reflexivity on the relations, which requires an ethic of the second person. The first person perspective is not enough to distinguish the kind of relationships we are dealing with. Now I come to the conclusion. My argument is that we have the need to go beyond classical personalism with the relational criterion. For classical personalism, the person transcends herself in her own action, while for the relational personalism, the person transcends herself in the relationship with the other, in the I-you relationship, which is due to the growing mediation of technologies. So the prospects are the following. After the digital matrix has covered the globe, which is to some extent inevitable, we all perhaps will become humanted, but the relational criterion, that is the criterion which distinguishes the human, will be even more discriminating than in the past, precisely because the specificity of the social relations which characterize human interactions. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Very much, Pierpaolo. Thank you for your important messages.